Hey, good afternoon and good morning to those of you that have joined us from overseas. I hope you're all doing well. Looking forward to some time off in a few weeks. I'm sort of getting a bit Christmassy with my jumper, but anyway, how are you doing, Rick?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. It's a good warm-ish morning here in Chicago, so super excited to be here. Thank you again, Melanie.
No worries. Well, we're still a bit cold over here. I think we only met, was it about 2 or 3 weeks? It just feels like it's coming around so quick, and we've got some really good topics, haven't we? Obviously, we've started to talk about all different sorts of things, but one of the things that we wanted to talk about today was really about contractors and when do you make somebody into a contractor, employee classification, because it's actually quite a big subject, isn't it? So before we start, it'd be great to hear where everyone's from today, because that's my geeky part. I love to see where everyone is from. And also, we do like to have these sessions as interactive. So if you have any questions for Rick, please ask. Don't be shy, because Rick's here with us for 45 minutes, an hour or so. So, you know, take this time to ask him. And ask him whatever questions you want, because you're not afraid, are you, Rick?
Not at all. I love questions and be tough questions. I'm perfectly fine with tough questions as well.
So, for those of you that have joined us for the first time, Rick, do you want to let everyone know who you are and a bit about your background?
Sure. Rick Hamill, I'm a founder. I've been a CEO. I've led HR organizations from a global perspective. I'm an author, but most important, I love to help people and kind of talk through how do we make sure HR and payroll is always at the table and helping making the best decisions for businesses. And so, as I think about these sessions that we have with GPA, I'm always thinking about making sure we get the right information to payroll and HR professionals to bring back to their leadership team and help them take it to the next level. So I'm here, but think of me kind of as a Rick Docs is what my team calls me, Rick Docs, and to kind of push it out there. If you have any questions, I'm happy to support there.
And good to see we've already we've got Shamika from Atlanta, so thank you for joining us. Okay, so shall we start then? So we're talking about employees, contractors, whether they should be permanent or contractors. How do we work all this out? So how would you define the key differences between a contractor and an employee?
Yeah, there's a number of things that you want to think about, but there are key components of what a contractor is and what an employee is. And it's a very thin line. And I think it's really important for employers to understand that. Many organizations think, oh, you know what, if we don't have an entity established in a country, we can hire someone as a contractor and we'll give them an email address. They'll feel like an employee, but we can pay them as a contractor and we've got this mutual agreement and that's perfectly fine. Well, that's actually not necessarily true or compliant in many countries. An employee is someone that you have give right of direction for, someone that is working only on behalf of the company. They are under a contract or they have a certain time schedule that they have to work. And that particular moment, it's really important how you distinction from a contractor. If a contractor comes in and has a company email address, you're telling them to work 9 to 5. You're having them work on key projects for yourself. You're giving them right of direction. They're part of the strategic plan of the business. That is really deemed as an employee. And I think a lot of employers get in trouble behind that and what that looks like. In many countries as well, there's limitations on what a contractor is versus an employee. I'll give an example of Honduras. Honduras requires that you can only be a contractor for 60 days before you could be deemed an employee from that perspective. And I've seen many employers make that mistake, particularly in Honduras. Recently, I'm helping a client with that, where they came in, they hired somebody, they said, look, we're going to be a contractor, we don't have an entity there. The employee, and I'm saying employee for a reason, actually agreed to that. But when it came down to rights, like maternity rights, paternity rights, leave, sick leave, that employee came back and said, well, I'm doing everything that an employee is doing. I should be entitled to these rights. And when they went back and forth with their attorneys in country, they realized that the employee was actually acting, the contractor was acting as an employee. So what ended up happening is, one, they realized they were non-compliant in Honduras, but then two, they realized that they had penalties associated with that. And those penalties meant that, based on Honduran law and a number of other countries in Latin America, that an employer actually takes on the burden of both the employer and the employee tax portions if the employer actually misclassifies or mistaxes the employee. So they actually had to go back 9 months, cover the taxes for the employee, cover the taxes for the employer side, and pay any penalties to the government as well because of that, simply because there was a misclassification. The government never looks at the employee's agreement; they look, or the contractor's agreement, and they agree to that particular terms. They really think about what the employer's actions were, and the employers actually held it responsible regardless of the agreement between both parties.
So, can you identify any common misconceptions or myths about contractor and employee classifications?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is that they can still operate the same way that an employee does, but you don't have to pay tax. And this is where the most important part of that is governments are looking for tax dollars. That's at the end of the day, that's what governments want to do. And because of that, they find that most employers who do go that contractor route, it's because of tax liability. And they don't want to register their entities, or they don't want to have pay employer taxes in that particular country. So because of that classification, they say, look, if you're going to go this route and we find out that you're actually not doing it correctly, we're going to make sure we collect our tax dollars regardless. But really, it's what the right of direction of the employee. If you have right of direction of an employee, that employee is with the company email and they're working only on behalf of your company, then real in actuality, they are truly an employee versus a contractor.
So, have you come across a situation where maybe like an EOR or a company is persuading or encouraging an employer to move their permanent employees to contractors?
Yeah, I think we've seen that come up a lot actually in the last couple of years, especially when the economies have not been very strong, and so a lot of companies are trying to figure out ways to cut costs or to streamline kind of their overall workforce management. And we've seen that where they've gone from an employee status to a contractor status, and how they entice the employee would be your net pay will be a little bit bigger. We're going to give you slightly of a bump, and it looks advantageous to the employee. The flip side to that is the benefits and the rights that the employees are entitled to behind that. And so, if you're a contractor, for example, and you go on maternity leave or paternity leave, an employer can say, "Well, you're a contractor; we don't have to give you those rights." Healthcare and benefits. A lot of carriers are now cracking down on employers who are giving benefits to their independent contractors because they're actually not employees. And so you could lose your healthcare benefits behind that as well. This particular case, I've actually had this come up with another client before, where an employer, a provider came to them and said, look, you don't need to keep them as full-time employees. You can keep them, you can turn them into contractors and you can save this much money. Well, what ended up happening with that employer, and it wasn't in every country, but it was quite a few of the countries they were operating in, there was tax and penalties that came to them because of that. It only took one whistleblower to say, "Hey, this is not correct," and that unfortunately that whistleblower was in HR that said this was not correct, and it sparked an investigation which caused a lot of penalties, and they actually had to convert them back to employees, and then also had to do back pay for anyone that actually paid out taxes, the employer portion of taxes on their behalf. So it actually ended up being a mess because of that. But it was because they listened to a provider versus actually kind of doing their own due diligence. One thing that I will add to that as well is anytime you look at converting a contractor to an employee or leveraging an employer of record, which they act as the legal employer on your behalf, or establishing yourself in an entity in a particular country, it's really important that you do your due diligence, really understand what's best for your business and the ramifications, the pros and cons behind whatever structure you're looking at putting in place. It's great to partner with the provider that can help you walk through that, but you are ultimately responsible as the employer or the one that's signing the contract. And so when you look at that, it's going to be important that you get a few viewpoints behind it. I always recommend a tax accountant or a tax attorney or your labor attorney and involving the vendor from that perspective to make sure everyone's on the same page. Sometimes the interpretation of what someone calls an independent contractor, that varies one by country and also varies by provider. So it's really important to do your due diligence and dive in deep in that. But there are a lot of ramifications, especially when converting employees to contractors versus contractors to employees.
So we're not going to necessarily focus on an employer of record today, but we'll. But I do have a question about an employer of record then. So on the legal side, so if there is a misclassification from the employer of record, if you're using an employer of record, a provider, whose responsibility is it? Is it theirs or is it yours as an employer?
So it's both. So you have the right of direction of the employee. That's the most important thing. The employer of record is the employer of record should never be a contractor, by the way. An employer of record should be an actual legitimate way of hiring an employee as a employee, where you don't have an entity in that particular country, or if you're looking to shut down that entity and converting them from your entity to an employer of record. So there should never be a contractor designation to an employee when you're using an employer of record. Now, if you're using a solution like a contractor pay solution, or what they also call agent of record AOR, that solution, there's a component where if you are doing it, paying them as a contractor, you would be legally responsible because you're paying them from your entity from that perspective. The agent of record solution is where the provider actually takes on that responsibility for you. Now, if there's a misclassification behind that, that agent of record would be responsible for that classification for you. But you have to remember that you are still the employer who has managed, you're managing the employee or the contractor from that perspective. So there will be some liability that comes for you because you're the one that has right of direction. I will also caveat that it's important that you review your contracts as well. Sometimes in that fine print, if it's in the terms and conditions on a website, or if it's actually in the actual MSA agreement or SOW, it will actually outline true liability. Most providers will say, we're liable if we make a mistake, but ultimately you are the one that makes the decision. And because you make the decision, you are the one that actually makes the mistake, regardless of what the provider makes. So that actually they will push that liability right back on you because they may give you a suggestion, and it's always a suggestion. But if you act on that suggestion, then you are the one that makes the decision, which means that you ultimately become liable and responsible.
Yeah, one of my friends is using an employer of record, and the suggestion was, on the contractor side, but the thing was, it's, the small print was, this is your responsibility to decide what, whether an employee, contractor, or whatever, it's down to you at the end of it. But it was little print, small print.
Well, I think, Melanie, the point of that is, look, there are some really good providers out there, and there's some really bad providers out there. It's always really important that you do your due diligence, and I call it the perfect trifecta. If you're using a contractor solution, if you're using an employer of record solution, you've got to think what's best for your business, because not all solutions work best for your business. And so you've got to look at what's the tax ramifications. Are you creating nexus in that particular country? And creating nexus meaning that, are you creating an establishment where you have a particular tax liability that comes out of there because you may be generating revenue in that particular country. You also have to think of, you're establishing office space, or if you're establishing product or manufacturing, there's certain licenses that are required to do business in that particular country, which means you have to have an entity. You cannot leverage an employer of record, or you cannot leverage a contractor solution, because there's liabilities that tie to that contract and what you're actually doing in that country. So it's quite important that you guys think about what's best for your business and ask from that trifecta. You can talk to the provider, but you also want to talk to your in-house counsel, or external counsel, and then a tax accountant as well. That'll kind of give you that kind of perspective, and then you can make a solid decision.
Okay, so we have a question. Thank you, Andrew. What strategies do you use when determining whether to use contractors versus part-time employees?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I do this as well. I've got multiple companies that I'm invested in. I've got a startup that I'm working on right now. And I had to think about what's my best strategy, because it's a global organization. So I had to think about, is it going to be project-based? If it's going to be a fixed term, what responsibilities am I going to give the individuals who I'm calling contractors? Am I leveraging them as individuals? Am I leveraging them as corporations? So I look at overall what's the methodology. When I use contractors, it's typically for a fixed term, and it's for a project-based work. And I give them right of direction. So we don't tell them you have to be in 9 to 5. We say, look, as long as the job gets done and we're going to give you a monthly fee, this allows us to be compliant with those particular rules and regulations. I do allow them to be to get insights into the organization or join team calls. But we're very clear that that's not an obligation, that they can join when they can, because we want to make sure they give them that freelancer expectation. But typically, when I look at contractors, it's for a fixed term project based kind of scenario. And I can always extend a project or add new projects to them, but it's really based on that type of work when you outline. And also, one thing you want to look at is how you're paying them as well. If you're paying them locally, if you're paying them from your US or UK entities, you've got to look at how that's going to impact them and make sure that you have the right tax documentation for a contractor from that perspective as well.
Well, thank you, Andrew. And if anybody else has got any more questions, please add them to the comment box. So how does misclassification impact organisations from a legal and financial perspective?
Yeah, the biggest one is the penalties, right? Again, I always say, when you're jumping into a contractor agreement, it's everything's hunky dory. Everyone's happy because is getting income, someone's got something done, and they have a project base, or they have someone that can actually do the work that they need in that particular country. It's always when things go awry, right? When you're ready to terminate a contract, or there's some type of bad blood or something like that. It's really when that particular contractor comes back and says, "Hey, I actually am an employee and I'm entitled to those rights." And the biggest rights that you typically find is unemployment, right? I want to make sure I can collect unemployment, but if you're a contractor, you can't collect unemployment in many cases. And so when those things come up, they create bigger issues. And using the examples I used earlier, that tax ramification, those penalties that come up, and especially when someone says they're doing this with multiple contractors, then it can open up an investigation. And investigations then create bigger actions because it affects your workflow, it's what you're working on, and you have to actually produce documentation of what you're actually doing from a global perspective as well. And then with that, it then puts you some risk, gives you some risk as well in other countries, because once one employee talks about it or when it becomes fodder within the organization, other employees start to think about it, or other contractors start to think about it as well.
So if there's an investigation, can they go back years? So it's just not present time?
Yeah, typically you see up to 3 years. I've seen in a couple countries up to 5. I think one country, and I think that was Brazil, went up to 7. But you typically see 3 years is typically the average, but it can get up to 7.
So it really can open a can of worms, basically, with just one investigation, one person, and then it can have a snowball effect.
Yeah, and when you show a pattern as well, that's where it becomes a snowball, right? So if it's not just one, but you've done this multiple times and maybe not compliantly in a given country, then that's where it becomes a snowball, right? And so it's just really important to really understand and set the kind of the parameters of how you're operating with contractors. And then realistically, when you are thinking about, hey, this is feeling more like an employee relationship, it's okay to convert from a contractor to an employee, because you can give original hire date status, you can give tenure credit to an employee with an employment agreement. You can do those things to help cover and make sure that the employee is not losing anything. And converting them over can be very simplistic. The challenge with that, though, Melanie, I like to point out, though, is there's 2 things. Converting contractors to employees, they do realize that they're going to have tax withholdings, so their net income can change. And so you do sometimes have to bump them up because they are used to a certain amount of income that's coming in. Some contractors in certain countries, I use Brazil as an example. Brazil actually incentivizes contractors where they have lower tax liability from an individual contractor perspective. And because of that, it's actually their tax liability is less than an employee would be. So then you've got to figure out how to gross that up and support them from that perspective. And then also the flip side of that as well is, how do you make sure that you're doing it the right way? And let's say you don't have an entity in that particular country, you can leverage services like an employer of record, where they'll come in and actually help convert that and make sure you're doing it the right way as well. One thing that I also saw come up with another client is they were getting ready to be acquired. And when they were going through due diligence, I think they had about 25 contractors that they had to convert over to employees because they couldn't close the deal due to non-compliance from that perspective. And so they didn't have entities in those countries. The company that was acquiring them did not have entities in those countries. So they were able to leverage an employer of record to convert them from contractors to employees, and allowed them to transition and close that deal from an M&A perspective fairly quickly.
Yeah, that's that's really complex, isn't it? There's just so much to think about. So when you've got a remote like workforce, and you've got people working in the gig economy, are there any tips on how to navigate that side and the complexities?
Yeah, I think you have to. There's a lot of research online, but I say you can't trust everything online. Everything's correct. It's honestly asking very tough questions, using forums like GPA or other forums out there that talk about the contractor versus employee component. Speak to your employment lawyers, and I know that there's a cost that comes with speaking with your employment lawyers, but that minimum cost that you have for that call or that research they'll do for you will save you a lot in the long run if you do something incorrectly from a classification perspective. So I think it's really important just to take that extra step and not just hire someone right away. And as a contractor, really look at what's going to be best for your organization to make sure you're setting up yourself in a strong foundation. Now, I will say, and here's the risk side of being a founder and CEO, you've got to balance that a little bit. If you know that you're going to maybe set up an entity and it's going to take 90 days or 120 days, you may want to put that person on a contractor basis for a short term for a project, and then convert them when that entity is set up. And you can set that expectation up front from that perspective, which will allow you to do it correctly. But you got to again make sure that during the time that they're a contractor, they're truly operating that realm. But you do have the opportunity to say, look, we are going to set up an entity for the time being during your probational period, which would typically be 30, 60, 90 days. We're going to have you as a contractor, and then we're going to convert you over. But as a contractor, your limitations are X, Y, Z. And that's I've seen that work, and that's worked really well. And then when that entity got established, or they decided to go to an employer of record model, they were able to convert pretty seamlessly.
And is there any strategies for your team that that are employing people to understand the differences of a contract employee classification? Like how would you what would you suggest to somebody how to get their employees informed? Does that make sense, that question?
No, no, I'm sorry, Melanie. Do you mind repeating that for me?
So what suggestion? I knew I wasn't saying it properly. It's the cold. That's what it is. I blame on that. So what advice would you give me, for example, to get my team trained up to actually understand what the differences are? Because you have to rely on your team. You can't be in control of everything, can you? So how do you get your team up to speed? What tips can you give for that?
There are really good questionnaires, online questionnaires that is 5 or 6 questions where you can ask to say what that individual is going to be doing and how they should be classified. And Melanie, I can share after this. I can put this in the on the forum so everyone wants to see it. There's quite a few of them that are out there. One thing that and the product that I'm launching next year, we actually have that questionnaire. We've built it into our platform, so it's like, how do you want to hire somebody? Please answer these questions, and this is what this is going to give you. Kind of our suggestion, our recommendation is you hire them as an employee, or you hire them as a contractor, or you leverage an employer of record. We're trying to be proactive in that because, to your point, a lot of people don't know that. So if someone came in our platform and said, "I'm going to hire a contractor," and then we would ask them questions, and we say, "Wait, you can't hire them as a contractor. They're doing X, Y, Z. You need to go to an employer of record model, or you need to go to a global payroll model where you have your own entities." But it's really getting that feedback in front of everyone. And the laws change based on a lot of bad actors out there. So when something's caught, then the law adapts to that as well. So it's really important that you can leverage those type of products, leverage your outside counsel to really help educate your teams. I've actually recommended there's DLA Piper is one of the really best one. Caden's another good one as well. that can actually come on site and support trainings for employers and their leadership team to really understand classifications behind that. And then again, I do this as well for consulting purposes, but we do come out and really, walk through, put some kind of strategies together and help them understand what it takes to make sure you're classifying your workforce the right way, and especially on a global scale. Sometimes we look at, I'm seeing this from a U.S. bias, we look at it from a 1099 perspective, which is an independent contractor and an employee, but those rules are very only much for the US. So we've got to look at it how each country actually classifies it, because it can be very different in many cases.
Yeah, so it's worth the investment of getting your team on board and understanding what they need to know before you move forward, really, or you get third party advice. It's just having that basic understanding, and it sounds so much easier just being able to get something off the internet. Obviously, I know you need to check everything, don't you? But
Well,
being
sure,
able,
GPT's everything's correct, right?
shall I do that now? Quickly check what ChatGPT says.
I'll think it's really important as you kind of think through that, because when someone says to me that they want to do training, I don't think you need to train your entire leadership team on that. It's your risk departments, your payroll team, your HR team are the ones I think that you have to make sure they sit down, because those are your gatekeepers for your business. So if a sales leader or a leader wants to hire someone in Japan, for example, and says, look, we'll just hire them as a contractor and that's all we need to do. It's really important that, again, payroll, HR, and risk are at the table and can say, hey, let's talk through that. Walk me through what this individual is going to do, and they can leverage a technology like what we've got, or they can find online, and they can go in and actually answer those 6 questions and say, well, no, we can't hire them as a contractor. Here are our 2 options. Does this fit within your budget, or does this fit, or do we need to think about this a different way? And that it really allows us to have very thoughtful conversation to make sure it's being done the right way.
We have got a question, but one thing I will say, what I'm finding from when I'm speaking to people is the challenge of actually speaking to the CEO or the board and getting them to actually understand that they just can't move a permanent person into an employee, into a contractor role, just to save money on tax or whatever. And maybe that's where the GPA can help people be able to speak to the board and get their point across, because actually you're saving the money at the end of the day, aren't you?
Yeah, I think there's a question out there, so we can answer the question too. But I think really is that contractor working for a better benefit than other than themselves? If they're working for the benefit of the company and truly operating like an employee, that's a thin line, and that can get you into a lot of trouble. Do you want to read the question?
Yeah, so we've got the question here. Mike, thanks so much. I know Mike, so hi, Mike. You mentioned managing contractors from a HR perspective should be different to avoid the direction of work issue. Can you elaborate more on that, please?
Yeah, so contractors we have to be very careful with in how you issue, work schedules to them, how they attend meetings, what's considered mandatory and what's not mandatory. It's just really important that contractors have they don't have direction. There's no right of direction from an employer perspective. They're treated almost like vendors, and that's hard to say from an HR perspective, because you want to make sure that everybody, your people operations, are seamless and they've got the same experience. But from a contractor perspective, you've got to be very careful, because if you do tell that contractor they have to be in an office, or they have to be at a certain location, or they have to be on certain calls at certain times, where they don't have flexibility in that, you can seem like you're giving right of direction just the way that you would give an employee. Another one is we've seen is certain benefits. A number of employers have said, "Hey, look, we want to still you're an independent contractor, but we're going to give you access to our benefit plans, so our medical, dental, vision, and sometimes stock options." When you look at that, so the employee has the contractor has an email address, they have benefits, they have stock options. It really looks and smells like an employee versus an independent contractor. And governments, when they do their audits from that perspective, they're going to say, wait, you've got right of direction of the employee, you pay them on a particular schedule, you're having them in certain meetings, you're giving them benefits, they've got stock options. Why are they not an employee if you're doing all this the same exact way you're doing with an employee? So you've got to have a distinction between the two and how you operate with contractors and how you operate with employees. And again, same thing with fixed term, long term. We've seen, using the example of Honduras, when they had a contractor for 9 months, and actually they had about 4 or 5 contractors for 9 months. When the law said 60 days, the government then said, well, these are employees based on everything else. You have benefits, you're controlling the time, they've got a company email address. You know what? We're going to consider them an employee, and they were hit with penalty behind that.
So if you're using an employer of record, how does an organisation ensure that documents align with legal requirements and accurately reflect classification, especially if you've got employees all around the world?
Yeah, so the employer of record model is actually that it's kind of a safe bet for a number of employers. And the reason why it's a safe bet is, and again, I'm going to caveat this by a direct employer of record versus a third party employer of record because there's certain liabilities behind both. With a third party employer of record, what I like to call an indirect employer of record, they are passing that buck to whoever their provider is in the country, so the liability doesn't really sit with them. But when you work with a direct employer of record, that direct employer of record has shared liability. They are the employer. So if they make a mistake, they're ultimately responsible. If the client makes a mistake, they are still ultimately responsible in the eyes of the government. So there's a invested interest to make sure it's done correctly from that perspective. And so when you have an indirect employer of record, they're passing it along. Now, I always get back to the contractor piece of that, Melanie, is that if you have an employer of record saying, hey, we can still bring them on, but we'll bring them on as a contractor, that's a big red flag because an employer of record should always be looking at it in the best way to make sure you're fully compliant. And that doesn't mean that they're a yes company. It's the one that's going to make sure you're doing it the right way. And so when I started my employer of record, it's one of my investment companies that I had. I started that one 9 years ago. I was very keen on having a direct model because when I was in HR, I saw the inconsistencies and non-compliance where they were actually paying employees as contractors, and I wasn't even aware of that, or they were using third parties to do certain things. And so that direct employer of record where they have their own entity is actually very powerful, and the kind of the partnership that you have and how you expand. And they'll actually make sure that you're doing it the right way, again, from a direct employer perspective.
How do you keep up with all the different changes? Because as you say, when there's a case comes up, the law changes, doesn't it? And this will happen with all different countries. How on earth do you keep on top of it? On top of it all, is it best to use the provider, or how else would you be able to keep on top of it all?
Yeah, if it's regarding contractors or employees from your own entities or an employer of record, it's daunting. I like to say my beard turned white quite a few times because of it, but it is. It's the laws change, and actually during 2020, it's probably where we saw the most frequency and change with employment laws because of COVID, and the governments are trying to protect their citizens, but also make sure that employers weren't just terminating all their employees. So there was a lot of rules and regulations that changed, and we had to keep up with that. So working with a provider that has global coverage it's really important. So it's not someone that just outsources third parties. It's someone that really actually understands it. And that's why I get back to like the direct model is really important. But also when you look at payroll as well, there are a number of great payroll providers out there that have technology and that actually has the global footprint that can actually help you from that perspective too. But I always getting back to that trifecta. I never recommend just hearing from one person. It's important that you dot your I's and cross your T's. And so leveraging really good law firms. I mentioned two earlier, DLA Piper and Cadden, excuse me, who can really dive in and really support you from that and really help guide that kind of decision making and how to actually operate. They are very familiar with the contractor model. They're very familiar with the employer of record model, and they have the ability to really help guide and help make decisions. And sometimes they say it's a really good decision to go that direction. And sometimes they say it's probably based on your kind of business needs and what you're looking to accomplish over the next couple of years to actually set up your own entities and just have a global payroll provider. But having that kind of trifecta that supports you and help make that decision is great. But again, a good provider will actually say the same thing to you. Any provider that says, yes, we can do anything, is not a good provider, because at the end of the day, you are the one making decisions. They don't have the liability behind it. So I think it's really important to do your due diligence behind that.
You need somebody that's going to look after your back.
Yeah.
You've mentioned quite a lot, and also in our last session, direct and indirect models. Is it normal to ask when you go to a provider, are you a direct model or indirect?
You should ask. And the reason why is, look, when I created my last company, I was very much focused on how do I simplify global expansion. I was an HR provider, and I had employees in Saudi Arabia, Singapore, Japan. I had contractors in the UAE. I had contractors in the UK, and I was trying to figure out how to do it the right way and make sure that it was very simplistic for me. And this is 15 years ago, where everything was really done on Excel at that point. And I just found that there's a better way to do it. So when I left that organization and sold my house and invested into setting up that organization, it was very much to make sure that I did the investment. I learned how to do business in that particular country. And again, it's not easy. It's not for the faint heart from that perspective, but truly understanding how to do business, the cuts and bruises that come with doing business in that particular country, it's really important. When you work with providers, provider that says we've always got it right, it's perfect, we know what we do, we've got 100% accuracy, they're not being upfront, because doing business truly in a country, laws change, and to be able to say, hey, we've learned and we've navigated from that perspective. And now, because of those lessons learned, those cuts and bruises that we've gotten, we're going to show you how not to fall those holes. We want to make sure that you, based on our lessons learned, are actually going to be doing it the right way. Those are the best providers, because they'll actually help you navigate. And a good provider, by the way, regardless if it's a contractor of record solution, employer of record solution, these providers that tell you no sometimes are the ones that you know that you can trust the most. The ones that say yes every time, they're just trying to get a deal closed. You want to really partner with someone that really understands how to do business in that country.
Actually, that's a really good bit of advice. Sometimes you do need to be told no, and you should listen as well. So we do have a question here. Thank you, Navin. After how many developers on EOR should we recommend to open their own entity? I usually tell after 15 employees.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's actually, that's exactly right. It's about 15 to 20 employees in a given country. Just makes sense from an offboarding perspective. Look, an employer of record will get you into a country and be able to hire talent very quickly, and compliantly in that particular country. It's a little bit costly from that perspective. It's a good investment up front, but when you start to get to a certain scale, the investment is not there realistically. So you have to graduate to the kind of the next level. And typically that's about 15 to 20 employees. Now, I have seen companies go all the way up to 50 employees, but they had a very low cost base, from a salary base from employees. So it really depends on your business and what country you're in. But the sweet spot is about 15 to 20 employees. I have seen some go a little bit higher. I've seen a little bit lower, but that 15 to 20 employee base is what you typically find.
So, out of your experience, what's the longest it's taken in one country to set up an entity?
18 months.
Wow,
18 months and $150,000.
oh my God. So that's really long, isn't it? So especially if if I take myself as an example, you're excited, you want to go into a new country, you want to take on staff, and that could be a massive issue for 18 months, or how.
Well, Melanie, that's exactly why people go through the contractor route, right? Like it's
Yeah.
more cost effective, it's faster. They can, they have the flexibility because it's a freelancer. The flip side of that is everything I mentioned earlier, and that's why they also can leverage an employer of record from that perspective. So it's really the classification of how do you want to do a contractor or an employee. An employee can mean directly through your own entities that you've established, or an employer of record model. But it's you've got to balance it out from that perspective. And again, all three models work. I mean, we see a number of organizations working in all three different models, and they've got their workforce in many different ways and many different solutions in different countries. But when you look out at that time frame, it's really based on what's best for the business. It's really based on what makes sense in your overall strategy, or if you're testing a market or not. And a contractor or an employer of record model, it's really good when you're testing the market and you don't know you're going to have that big investment. And when you start to get scale, you start to you look at your revenue there, then you say, okay, it's time to maybe start that process to set up our own entities.
I just had to smile then because of Serena's question. Everyone's thinking like, which one took 18 months?
Well, it was Brazil, but it was because of the complexity of the client that we were supporting in that particular country. But Brazil took the longest because of the shared capital, and it also took because of the licensing requirements that they had. To that point, setting up an entity is not just getting your entity registration number. It's actually setting up your pensions and your tax registrations and all of that so that you can employ an employee. So it's not just getting the entity done. It's actually everything that you have to do after that to be ready to actually employ an employee. And that's where I think a lot of people get confused. I've seen, actually just had a call the other day with a client. They go, we just set up our entity in China. And you're like, great. But you can't employ people because you're missing these 5 things. And this is going to take you another couple of months. So it's really important about that as well. And just so I said your comment again, it's also the bank accounts. Establishing bank accounts in foreign countries can also be a challenge as well. Again, in many countries, when you're paying an employee, you also have to pay taxes locally as well, and they don't accept foreign wires or transfers from that perspective. So having a local bank account can do that. Now, there are providers out there that can give you virtual bank accounts and things like that to really support both from an employee and a client perspective. But there are also certain regulations in regards to how taxes are paid and how they get funds from those bank accounts. And so, yes, Brazil is one of those countries where it can be a little bit challenging with bank accounts, but they're not the only one. There's quite a few out there from that perspective.
Yeah, we have complexity surveys in payroll, and I think like Italy, France are usually up there. But then obviously when you go to other countries, you're right, you've got issues with actually physically paying. And I think during COVID, that was one of the issues was banks were closing down, and not literally, but just they'll just shut for a day or they'll be shut for a week, and people couldn't get funds to employees. So there's so much to think about, isn't there? It's not just about the processing payrolls or HR or contracts, it's everything else, isn't it?
Yeah, and Melanie, one thing you have to think about too from this model is that, and getting back to the contractor piece,
Yeah,
visas are also tied to employees.
yeah.
Um, and so having an independent contractor, if they have a visa, if you have talent that's living in a foreign country and them and their families are tied to visas, they could lose their visa status as well if they're not actually hired as an employee through your own company or through an employer of record.
There's so much to think about. So is EOR liable if client does not pay the monthly compensation?
That is correct. So you are the legal employer. And so that's the risk, and that's what you pay for. I mean, to be very honest, that is your fee that you're paying for, is the liability that employer of record is taking on your behalf. So if for any reason a client does not pay the employee, it's still the employer of record's liability to pay that employee. They're still the actual employer. Now, on the flip side of that, there are certain caveats and contracts that clients have with the employer of record model, where it says, look, if you don't pay us, you're still liable. We're gonna push it to you, and there's interest that comes behind that as well. That's also why a number of employer of records collect deposits. If it's 1 to 2 or 3 months, I've seen in liability that they collect, is because if for any reason a client defaults, they still have to pay that employee, not just for the current cycle, but the termination cycle as well. So if an employer of record is only asking for 1 month of deposits, then they have to think, okay, well, you got 1 month, but I've now paid the current payroll. They're actually even more invested into you from that perspective, because if you don't pay, they still have that liability from that second month of that termination pay that they have to do based on notice periods owed to that employee. But yes, to answer your question, technically, the legal employer is always responsible because the contract with the employee is with the employee and the employer of record.
Okay. We need like some charts, don't we? We need to produce some. So we talked about conflict. So in the event of a dispute or disagreement over worker classification, what process does an EOR have in place to sort this out? What should an employer record do?
Melanie, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that question again. Sorry.
Is it me? I'm going to blame it because we've got COVID in the house. So, in the event of a dispute or disagreement over worker classification, what processes does the EOR have in place for conflict resolution? Sorry.
Yeah, so the classification of an employee, again, an employer of record should be making sure that the client is compliant at all times. So if for any reason the employee is brought on, let's say as a contractor, and the employer of record agree to that kind of classification, then the employer of record would say, look, we're going to take on that liability. They're responsible for the liability because they took action from that liability perspective. And that term would be the agent of record if they're hiring them on a contract basis under their own liability. So whoever actually owns the liability is the one that signs off on it. So if I brought on an employee and I put them in the wrong CBA, if I hired an employee and put them under the wrong workers' compensation classification, I would be responsible for that because I'm taking that liability and I signed off on it. If a client has that, so if they are working with a provider that's just processing payments, so a payroll provider, and they are hiring this contractor, the client actually has that full liability from that perspective because the payroll provider or that agent of record, or sorry, that contractor of pay record solution, where they're actually just processing payments, they're just the processor. And so from that perspective, the client takes that full liability. And what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to take a step back and they're going to have to do that due diligence, as I mentioned earlier, to say, hey, where did we miss this? And what is that employee or contractor actually doing that we have to correct that classification for?
So I think we're coming to a natural end to the discussion. And thank you so much for everybody that has asked questions. If you do have anything, please add it now just before or while we wrap up. I think one of the key things I've learned from your sessions, Rick, is that really people do need to do their due diligence and make sure that they ask the right questions, and whether or not you are using a provider, just make sure you pick the right provider for your organization.
Yeah, I think, look, I'm a natural salesman, but I've been in HR, I've done those things, but I think the right company, the right partner is one that partners with the company to make sure they do it the right way. And sometimes that means saying no. And we don't like to hear that, right? We've got a plan, we just need to process a payment. But if we want to make sure that you're partnering with a good partner, they're going to walk you through that process. And having to go through the employer of record models and selling that service, and even what I'm building today with my next investment that's launching next year, we are very much methodical on how we can think about servicing our clients and how do we simplify global expansion. Global expansion is tough. If it was easy, we won't be here. We wouldn't be having these conversations. But having a partner that's going to handhold you through that, if it's through technology or through service, that's what you need to make sure that you're doing that. But again, never just rely on the provider. It's important that you do, again, that trifecta kind of due diligence check to make sure you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's, because ultimately it's your brand, it's your employee experience. And because of that, you have to make sure you're doing it the right way. Outside of that, if you don't care about those things, that's a different story. But as HR and payroll professionals, our employees are the foundation of our business, and we need to make sure we're giving them that support and make sure that we're making sure we're doing our due diligence to improve their overall experience.
So my last question then to you, Rick, is how do you anticipate the landscape of worker classification evolving in the future? What's your crystal ball?
Yeah, post-COVID, the world has changed, right? A lot of people, if you remember during 2020, there were a lot of people that were laid off from jobs and they had to figure out, how to navigate. And a lot of them created a lot of entrepreneurs at that point. There was a lot of people have figured out, I call it the side hustle, right? They had to figure out how to make ends meet. And because of that, it really changed the game and how people went and made income. Gig workers, there's a lot of reports out there that talk about employees having multiple jobs. They have a full-time job and they've got their side hustle and they're doing certain things. You saw the birth of TikTok just taking off, and the influencer, and those are independent contractors from that perspective. So you've seen kind of the world evolve and change because of how people want to earn income and how they want to make sure they're not dependent on one employer from that perspective. The rules, though, unfortunately, is that countries don't always keep up with trends. It takes time for them to get up to speed. And so, as you see the world's changing, you're going to see laws change with that over the next 2 to 3 years and beyond, to really keep up with what that looks like. That means that you're going to have certain situations like nomad visas, which you're starting to see a lot in Europe. You're going to see, tax incentives for independent contractors, which is going to make it a little bit more challenging for compliance because people are going to want to pay less taxes. But it's the evolving of where the world's going with this is all based on kind of what's happening and trending in the world behind that. So it's going to evolve. Laws are going to change. It's just really important to keep up with them, and they're not going to change consistently. They're going to change by country, and in some cases by province within that particular country as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and really interesting when you're talking about the influencer side of things, because that that is a job in many cases now, which we may not have said 5-6 years ago, but it is. Okay, well, thank you so much, Rick. Did you want to say anything before we leave?
I was just saying, Melanie, thank you as always for having me. And guys, if anyone needs to have any questions, the last session I told everyone, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to answer those questions. And what's really great about that is I try to respond to all of those inquiries and try to get on the calendar. So please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to do that. There's no cost to that. I just really, my Achilles heel is to help people and to help make sure that we simplify global expansion. So feel free to reach out to me from there.
Well, thank you so much. Sorry about some of my questions today. I'm just going to blame it on the cold, But we look forward to seeing you in January. Have a really nice break, Rick. Hopefully you will stop working at some point over the Christmas period. I know you love your work, so I hope you do get some time off. And we hope to see everyone in January. So thanks once again. And as Rick said, if you want to ask him a question, he really does answer them. So make sure you contact him on LinkedIn. So thanks once again, everyone.
Thank you. Happy holidays, everyone.
Thank you.